thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Christian Hudak, and I am the director of the Dunhuang Foundation. This is a really a great pleasure for me, as my colleague Julia Grimes usually does the introductions, but I'm taking over her her workspace at the moment for just some logistical reasons. But it's a real thrill to be able to speak with you once again, and I know I can't see everybody on the other side of this, but I see a lot of familiar names, so that also heartens me. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today, or rather our moderator for today, Eric Huntington, who's a professor at Rice University, and also, along with Susan Huang, one of our collaborators for this lecture series. So without further ado, Eric Huntington specializes in the visual culture, ritual, and philosophy of Buddhism, employing interdisciplinary methods alongside comparative and historicizing frameworks. He seeks new ways for scholars to understand the fundamental ideas, practices, and material products of widely varying traditions. Eric's award-winning first book, Creating the Universe, which was published by University of Washington Press, examines portrayals of the cosmos in texts, rituals, artwork, and architecture to reveal cosmological thinking as a foundation for many aspects of religious life. Eric's current projects include a monograph on philosophies of representation in Buddhism and an edited volume on transnational connections of cosmology across Asia. And that ties in very nicely with this entire theme of transnationality. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Eric, and he will take over and moderate and introduce you to our lovely speaker today, Megan. So thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I want to just generally thank the Dunhuang Foundation for the wonderful opportunity to collaborate on this lecture series. Our new Department of Transnational Asian Studies here at Rice University is really excited to have this opportunity to highlight this theme of transnationality in Asia. I also want to thank everyone attending online for joining us today. Before we get started, I do have a quick announcement that we will be using the Q&A feature of Zoom to address audience questions at the end of the lecture. So as we get to the end of the lecture, please type your questions there, and then I'll read them to our speaker. So now let me introduce our speaker for today. Megan Bryson is currently an associate professor and associate head of religious studies at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Her research focuses on Buddhism in the Dali region, especially during the Nanzhao and Dali kingdoms. Since receiving the PhD from Stanford, Dr. Bryson has shown an exceptional ability to work across disciplinary boundaries and express nuanced histories, and I imagine and hope that we will see some of this today. Dr. Bryson is currently working on the book Buddhism on the Southwestern Silk Road, which examines visual, textual, and material networks related to the god Mahakala in the medieval period, with a focus on the Dali kingdom. She previously published the groundbreaking Goddess on the Frontier, Religion, Ethnicity, and Gender in Southwest China with Stanford University Press in 2017, and is the co-editor with Kevin Bucklew of a forthcoming volume called Buddhist Masculinities to be published with Columbia University Press. Today, I believe the presentation that we're about to hear is entitled Material Networks, Buddhist Ritual Daggers on Medieval Silk Roads. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bryson.
Thank you, Eric, for that very generous introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen. I'd like to start by thanking Rice University and the Dunhuang Foundation for sponsoring this lecture series, in which I'm very honored to participate. And thanks to all of you in attendance. I hope this talk proves to be worthy of your time. So my talk this evening focuses on circulations of a particular kind of Buddhist ritual object throughout medieval Buddhist Asia. These objects are often described as ritual daggers, stakes, or pegs, and as we will see, people in different places and times encountered them in various languages and material forms. As with many aspects of Buddhism, we begin this journey in South Asia, where texts first discuss stakes known as kila in Sanskrit, and eventually also a deity known as Vajrakila, diamond or adamantine stake. The first mystery surrounding the kila is that no material record survives, which led some scholars to hypothesize that these objects actually developed in the Himalayas, perhaps as part of pre-Buddhist culture. While scholars today generally agree that kila had some material form in South Asia, these objects are best known in their Himalayan form. The term Kila was translated into Tibetan as purba or purbu and deified in the figure of Dorje Purba. Purba first appear in Tibetan texts and perhaps also as ritual daggers as early as the 10th century. These objects generally feature a triple blade decorated with snakes and emerging from the mouth of a makara, a kind of sea creature, a handle with 2 endless knots framing an octagonal double lotus blossom, and a 3-faced wrathful deity head, often with a demi-vajra on top. They're usually made of wood or metal and can range widely in size and ornamentation. Another trajectory developed in East Asia, where texts translated Kila into the Chinese term jue, meaning stake or peg, by the 8th century. Though a deity called Kili Kila appears in East Asian texts, he never became the object of a thriving cult. I have not seen examples of physical stakes from China, but sets of stakes do survive from Kamakura, Japan, where they were known as kongoketsu, vajra stakes. While they share lotus blossom motifs with the Himalayan purba, no casual viewer would identify these as the same object. These stakes give us an indication of how medieval Buddhists in East Asia encountered and used these ritual objects in ways that diverge from the better known Himalayan forms. In addition to how these daggers or stakes appear in these widely studied forms of Buddhism, important examples pop up in less well-known, but no less important Buddhist regions. The Dutch scholar F.D.K. Bosch discovered an example from Java that bears remarkable similarities to stakes that survive from the Dali kingdom, located in what is now southwest China's Yunnan province. These Dali examples are attached to rings, as are similar objects from the Dali kingdom. As art historians Nicole Grimaud and Patrick Grimaud point out, the Dali daggers closely resemble Himalayan amulets known as tokcha in Tibetan, many of which are also attached to rings. Some of the other objects from the Dali kingdom attached to rings include single-pronged vajra pestles, which also appear in Japan, and with which East Asian texts sometimes conflate the ritual dagger or stake. So having given a brief introduction to these objects, it's time to consider the main question, or if I may, the stakes of this investigation. I apologize for that. One of the mysteries surrounding these daggers is how and why they became so important in Himalayan Buddhism, but did not gain traction elsewhere. Scholars such as Robert Mayer and Martin J. Board have noted the different textual and material kila used in Japan, as well as the apparent conflation of kila with single-pronged vajras. But thus far, I have not seen any in-depth studies of daggers or stakes in East Asian textual and material traditions. This lecture aims to trace the spatio-historical networks on medieval Silk roads that generated diverse understandings, uses, and forms of these Buddhist ritual objects. However, one of the questions raised by attempts to trace the kila's path through medieval Buddhist Asia is, what do we mean by kila? When we encounter objects with such diverse forms and uses as the images shown here, what does it mean to treat them as the same thing? By way of addressing this question, I propose that any investigation of kila must necessarily consider analogous objects that Buddhists have identified with the ritual dagger or stake, including the yupa, the single-pronged vajra, and tokcha. These objects share certain family resemblances that challenge the project of cleanly separating kila or purba from their cousins. In examining the material networks of these daggers or stakes in medieval Buddhist Asia, I also treat the daggers themselves as a kind of network of analogous objects. This leads to the real guiding question of this talk. How did kila, including analogous objects, travel along medieval Silk roads, and what does this tell us about Buddhist transmission? I'm going to answer this question by taking us through texts and objects related to these daggers in 4 regions. This is a lot of ground to cover, so the coverage will necessarily be general, with the goal of tracing transmission routes to the extent possible. As I go through the first 2 regions of South Asia and the Himalayas, I mainly draw from the work of the scholars listed here who have published extensively on the textual and art historical aspects of kila and purba. Though some of these scholars, especially Martin Board, have also paid attention to circulations of kila in Japan, East Asian stakes have received less attention because they diverge so much from their Himalayan counterparts. Even less attention has been given to daggers in places like Dali and Java, which are only really now entering conversations about Middle Period Buddhism. My own work on Dali Kingdom Buddhism, specifically efforts to make sense of its distinctive daggers and ritual texts, has inspired this project, and I'll devote a bit more time to Dali than to the rest of these regions. Because the Dali region neighbors Chinese, Tibetan, Burmese, and Vietnamese areas with Bengal not far beyond, Buddhist texts, objects, and ideas could and did enter along multiple routes. Yet gaps in the historical record, as well as shared ritual and material practices in Middle Period Tantric Buddhism, can make it impossible to determine how people in Dali encountered objects such as daggers. For this reason, I treat the material networks here as rhizomatic. This means that I focus on the objects that appear above ground, as it were, while allowing for multiple concealed root systems that carry these objects from one place to another. As I will demonstrate, it is possible to bring some of these concealed connections to the surface, but not all of them. So South Asian writings on the Kila can be traced to the Vedas, in which the divine warrior King Indra slays the serpent Vritra and pierces the floating mound of earth, releasing living beings and fixing the earth in place. Later Puranic literature refers to this primordial mountain as Indra's peg, Indrakila, and identifies it as Mount Mandara, which in the Mahabharata is the mountain the gods used to churn the ocean and extract the ambrosia of immortality, with the help of the serpent Vasuki as the churning rope. The Kila or Indrakila thus symbolizes the axis mundi, and specifically the meeting of mountain and water, with serpents playing integral roles. This symbolism relates to the architectural function of the Kila and Indrakila as a stabilizing vertical axis, akin to the mountain through which Indra stabilized the earth. Treatises on iconography and architecture describe multiple kinds of Kila. Lily de Silva notes that an Indrakila was the peg or bolt around which artists carved images of deities, and that the Indrakila became identified with deities and served as an object of worship itself. Robert Mayer cites prescriptions for the use of Kila in the serpent binding rite that evokes Indra's defeat of Vritra. Before construction can commence, the Naga or serpent of the site must be found and stabilized with a Kila made of Kadira wood to prevent disturbances. As construction ended, another peg or nail, known as the Stupi Kila, was installed at the top of the structure, directly above the Kila used to begin construction. The 7th century architectural treatise, Manasara, gives the following instructions for the shape of the Stupi Kila, which should be made of wood, preferably Kadira wood or iron. So we see the length or body of the nail is described as triangular, the base square, the middle part octagonal, and the top circular. The width of the nail at the top should be 1 angula, tapering gradually from base to top. The 2 Kila form an axis within the structure that mirrors the cosmic axis mundi. In addition to serving as cosmic axes, Kila also demarcated and protected designated spaces, including the funeral pyre, mandala, or field. De Silva and Meyer further relate these Kila to the Vedic sacrificial post, Yupa, which served similar functions as a vertical axis and which also relates to the later sacrificial practices associated with the Himalayan purba. Knotted ropes tied sacrificial animals to the octagonal Yupas, which were to be made of Kadira wood. South Asian Buddhists incorporated these Kila and Yupa features into their own cosmology and architecture, but with a twist. Instead of Mount Mandara, the Buddhist axial mountain of Meru became identified with the Indrakila. Many of the written descriptions of Kila and Yupa appear in the Himalayan purba, including the symbolic connections to Nagas and water, the octagonal shape and ties to knots, and the roles of demarcating and protecting ritual spaces. With the development of Tantric Buddhism and Hinduism, the Kila became not only a stake or peg for demarcating and protecting ritual space by pinning down potentially harmful forces, but also a dagger for inflicting harm. Medieval tantras often instruct practitioners to fashion a Kila of human bone or Kadira wood and stab an effigy, drawing, or object of an enemy. For example, the 8th century Chakrasamvara Tantra directs practitioners to stick a Kila made of human bone into an enemy's door, field, or animal pens to cause ruin. As a dagger wielded in the hand, the Kila drew closer to other pointed objects used in Tantric Buddhism, specifically the single-pronged Vajra. The single-pronged vajra is not a common implement in South Asian Buddhism, but it does appear as one of the implements held by, for example, Odiyana Marichi in both texts and images of the 11th and 12th centuries. It takes the same basic form as the better-known versions with 3, 5, 7, or even 9 prongs. These vajra pestles or pounders are extremely important ritual objects that channel divine power and lend their name to Vajrayana Buddhism. Like Kila, single-pronged vajra pestles number among the implements wielded by certain deities, and since both objects feature pointed ends, in some images it can be difficult to tell them apart. This confusion extends to the linguistic realm. The Tibetan term dorje zejikpa and the Chinese dugu jingangchu or Japanese toko kongosho directly translate single-pronged vajra, but can also be used to translate such terms as kanaya, bindipala, and kila. The deity Vajrakila brings together, in some respects, the concepts of the Vajra and the Kila dagger. Vajrakila likely arose in South Asian Buddhism before being incorporated into Himalayan and, to a lesser extent, East Asian Buddhism. Vajrakila embodies the Kila's power, and later Himalayan tradition presents the god as the dagger's animating presence. Cantwell and Meyer point to Vajrakila statues in Bengal and Java as evidence for the god's cult outside the Himalayas, but they note that Vajrakila remained a subsidiary figure in South Asian Buddhism. Other deities associated with the Kila or Purba share this trajectory. Vajrakumara, Amrita Kundalin, Hayagriva, and Mahakala all started out as relatively minor figures that had been converted to Buddhism from Hinduism. But around the late 10th century, Buddhist texts and images begin to depict them as more central deities. The many references to Kila in South Asian texts indicate that these pegs or daggers played critical and widespread roles in religious ritual, from demarcating protected space to stabilizing architectural structures to pinning down potentially harmful forces. Despite this apparent ubiquity, no examples of such Kila have survived. Perhaps Himalayan purba developed as increasingly ornate ritual objects based on much simpler South Asian precedents that were not preserved. In any case, by the 7th and 8th centuries, Kila were well attested in South Asian Sanskrit texts, even though none have been discovered in the material record. A similar dynamic continues as Buddhists from the Himalayas translated texts related to these Kila, known as purba or purbu in Tibetan. An overview of early purba ritual texts and the Himalayan purba objects will raise various possibilities for making sense of the relationship between text and object. Kathy Cantwell and Robert Meyer have pioneered the study of early Tibetan purba texts in their investigation of Dunhuang manuscripts on this topic, as well as received texts in the Nyingma canon, including the Guhya Samaja Tantra. They date the Dunhuang manuscripts to the late 10th to early 11th centuries, and given the post-1300 dates of most purba texts and objects, these pre-1300 sources are particularly valuable for showing how Tibetan purba practices took shape. As Cantwell and Meyer demonstrate, early purba texts do bridge the textual references from South Asian sources, the physical purba from the Himalayas, and representations of deities related to the purba, especially Vajrakila, aka Dorje Purba. Nyingma tradition classifies purba texts in the Mahayoga category. Cantwell and Meyer connect the rise of Mahayoga texts in 8th century Tibet to the myth of taming Rudra, which justified tantric violence. In this myth, the violent god Rudra, an emanation of Shiva, cannot be tamed peacefully, so the Buddhist deity Heruka kills him and then brings him back to life as a protector of the Dharma. Two early texts from the Nyingma Old Tantric canon structure the purba rite around this narrative, such that the purba becomes an instrument of liberative killing. Liberative killing justifies violence by framing it as an ultimately compassionate act that transforms ignorance into awakening. In the purba rite, the effigy is Rudra, and the purba itself is Heruka, aka Vajrakila, or a double such as Vajrakumara. By using the Heruka purba to kill Rudra, the practitioner effects Rudra's liberation. These early Nyingma texts overlap with some of the purba texts found at Dunhuang. The earliest text on purba is the late 10th century Dunhuang manuscript Paleo-Tibetan 44. This short text recounts how Padmasambhava and his disciples journeyed from Nepal to Nalanda to retrieve a purba text. Their journeys between Nepal and Nalanda involved the subjugation of 4 goddesses and a vision of the god Vajrakumara. The text also includes practices to effect the awareness of non-duality, which is achieved specifically by rolling the purba between one's palms and performing the following visualization. I'm not going to go ahead and read this out. I'll leave you to read it to yourself. But I want to highlight the particular terms that relate to earlier Kila writings, as well as to the material objects of purba that appear in the Himalayas. So as Cantwell and Meyer observe, this text connects to the later purba texts and objects in several ways. It presents Vajrakumara as the main deity associated with purba and further associates the purba with the class of Heruka deities. It identifies the purba with Mount Meru. It describes the practice of rolling the purba in one's palms, and it hints at several features of Himalayan purba objects, such as the 2 knots and 8 spokes. Additional Dunhuang purba manuscripts expand on these themes, especially in describing the ritual of using purba for liberative killing. For example, the text titled The Supreme Pacification, the Concise Enlightened Activity of Transference, prescribes purba rites to pacify those who cannot be subjugated through nonviolent methods. I'll briefly present the sections that relate to the appearance and ritual functions of the purba. First, the text prescribes the materials and features of the purba object. It should be made of iron, 5 other kinds of metal, sandalwood, or thorny wood. It should be 8 or 12 inches in length. It should have 2 1-inch knots. The upper part should have 8 facets. The lower part should have a 3-sided blade, and the purba should be imposing like Mount Meru. In another section, the text identifies 5 deities emanating from the syllable hum at the dagger's tip. Heruka in the center, Trilokya Vijaya in the east, Yamantaka in the south, Hayagriva in the west, and Mahabala in the north. After reciting these deities' mantras and making samaya offerings to them, the practitioner realizes non-duality. The text also describes the purba deity. Above the waist, his hair stands on end, his 3 eyes glare, and he bears his fangs. Skulls and snakes adorn him, and cremation fire engulfs him. His 4 arms hold an axe in the upper right, a skull staff or kadvanga in the upper left, a vajra in the lower right, and a purba in the lower left. Below the waist, his body is a dark blue, 3-sided iron purba. As we will see, this image appears in some of the earliest known Himalayan purba, and it resembles the Dali daggers. Lastly, this text prescribes a few different ritual uses for purba. The practitioner establishes and protects the ritual space using 10 purba that are consecrated as 10 wrathful deities. Then the practitioner creates a triangular mandala in an appropriate place, such as a cemetery, and then makes an effigy using human ashes or black sesame. The practitioner summons the ritual's target into the effigy, rolls the purba between their palms, and then pierces the effigy's heart, shoulders, thighs, and navel while reciting the Vajra Claw mantra. Purba texts continued to proliferate in Tibetan Buddhism. Though treated with some suspicion in a late 11th century polemic, the Shakya school adopted purba ritual, and as Martin J. Board has shown, it became particularly important in the later Northern Treasure lineage. Running parallel to the proliferation of purba ritual texts was the proliferation of purba ritual objects. Though some scholars previously identified these daggers as bone creations indigenous to Tibet, the wealth of textual evidence uncovered by Cantwell and Meyer suggests Indic precedents. John Huntington's 1975 study that cataloged different types of purba from different regions remains a valuable starting point for considering the relationship between these objects and the texts that describe them. Nicole and Patrick Grimaud's recent book on purba supplements Huntington's findings by considering even more variations and typologies of these ritual daggers. Huntington is fairly conservative in dating the daggers he surveyed, dating the oldest to the 14th century, shown here on the right, based on its Kashmiro-Tibetan style. The Grimauds follow Ngompo Ronge in suggesting that the oldest purba date to the 10th century, shown here on the left. Because I have not seen the rationale for this early dating, I am reluctant to fully embrace it here, though I allow it as possible. I do follow Amy Heller's argument for dating this central example to the 13th or 14th century, which is based on the unique eyelid shape matching the detail on a late 13th century painting. These early purba also reveal stylistic variations. The examples on the left feature a 5-pronged vajra handle instead of the double lotus blossom handle that appears in the center. The styles of the endless knots in the center and on the left are different, and the example on the right places a single endless knot atop the deity's head rather than on the handle. Most significantly, the example on the right replaces the handle with the deity's torso and thus lacks many of the purba's defining features, such as the two endless knots, makara heads, and snakes along the blades. The Grimots actually classify it in the appendix on unusual purba and question whether it should be considered a purba at all. As we will see, this question has bearing on the objects we will encounter from Dali and Java, which more closely resemble this example than any other style of Himalayan purba. But the variations don't stop here. We definitely don't have enough time to exhaustively catalog all the permutations that we find on purba, including those associated with the Bon religion or shamanic practices, but I want to highlight a few additional examples. Here on the left is a purba that recalls the description of the deity purba, that is Vajrakila, in the Supreme Pacification, which is bifurcated into the dagger-shaped lower body and the wrathful deity upper body. This somewhat resembles the purba just to the right, an example from Nepal that features the god Vishvarupasamvara. Huntington observed that Nepalese art preserved the iconographic conventions of 8th to 9th century Magadha, which suggests that this style with a deity torso or body above the blade represents an early form of these objects. As Amy Heller and Thomas Marcotti have noted, purba in this style cannot be used for most purba ritual because their shape and decorations inhibit rolling between the palms. Instead, these deity purba would have been objects of worship that usually stood in a base or socket and could be placed on an altar or in a mandala. Similarly, the very large purba to the right plays a different role, namely to stabilize and protect the monastery, though it shares stylistic features with its smaller counterparts. In contrast, Huntington explains that the purba on the right, a simple iron dagger, was inserted around the triangular iron altar used for rites of subjugation. Another important variation for us to consider is the adaptation of purba into amulets or tokcha. John Beleza has published quite a bit on his own and others' collections of tokcha, which are defined as metal objects produced by lightning strikes. These amulets take many forms, but they are generally worn close to the skin. Some have hooks or rings that allow them to be worn on necklaces or on fingers. The examples shown here include the far left purba with a hole on the top, lending itself to being looped on a string. Many tokcha include the Garuda or Kyung bird, which is also associated with purba. The image on the right, taken by John V. Beleza, shows a man wearing an amulet of just such a bird. Purba amulets, like those of the Garuda or Kyung, would offer general protection from harmful forces. As Nicole and Patrick Grimaud have noted, the daggers from the Dali kingdom may in fact belong to this tokcha category because they all feature rings, but I will return to this question later. So Himalayan Buddhists adopted and adapted texts related to Kila, which involved translating the Sanskrit term into the Tibetan purba. They probably adapted material Kila in similar ways, but the lack of extant objects from South Asia constitutes one of the buried connections that scholars of Kila and purba encounter. However, in this case, the connections may not be buried very deeply. After all, there are only so many routes linking India to the Himalayas. More questions about rhizomatic networks arise when we consider how Buddhist translators, ritual practitioners, and artists in East Asia grappled with the term and object Kila. Around the same time Buddhism was introduced to Tibet, monks from India and Central Asia began transmitting the scriptures of Tantric or esoteric Buddhism to Tang, China, where monastic teams translated them into Sinitic script and wrote commentaries on them. During the Song dynasty, monks from South Asia continued the project of translating Tantric Buddhist texts into Sinitic script, though ultimately on a smaller scale. Monks from Nara through Heian, Japan, and the Korean peninsula brought these Tang dynasty translations home and wrote their own commentaries. Japanese records also show that the monks Kukai and Engyo brought back ritual objects labeled Vajra stakes in sets of 4, as well as objects called single-pronged Vajra pestles, or single-pronged pestles. Though these terms refer to distinct objects, some texts conflated them, for example, by giving the Kila mantra before discussing the single-pronged pestle. Translators additionally transliterated the name of the deity, usually as Kili Kila, and retained the Sanskrit mantras for using the Kila and honoring Vajra Kila. The initial set of Buddhist texts that mention Kila were translated in the Tang Dynasty, and they include texts dedicated to deities such as Hayagriva, Vajrakumara, and Amrita Kundalin, which are also associated with purba ritual. Tang texts call for using the Kila to demarcate and protect ritual space and to actively neutralize harmful forces. For example, the Susiddhikara Sutra, whose translation was supervised by Shubhakara Simha, Shan Wei, lists the Vajra stake as a method for protecting the ritual area. It later gives the Vajra stake mantra and the wrathful Kili Kili mantra, which you see here. The Susiddhikara Sutra additionally explains how to make and empower these objects. Using Kadira wood, make 4 stakes, 1 2-finger handspan in size, sharpen one end like a single-pronged Vajra pestle, rub the stakes with red sandalwood unguent, and then tie a dark red string around them. Using the Vajra stake seal, hold them with a clenched fist, mantrify them with this mantra for the Vajra stake 100 times, and drive them into the 4 corners with the tip of the stake slightly visible. In the next chapter, on retrieving stolen ritual items, the texts present Vajra stakes as more active ritual tools. The practitioner is to make a wax effigy of the thief and then flog the effigy with a stick and broil it with fire, beat it in various violent ways, stab its limbs with madana thorns in accordance with the rite for Vajra stakes, rub salt mixed with black mustard seed oil all over its body, and torment it and inflict injury on it as you please. We also find 3 entries related to the Kila, or single-pronged Vajra stake, in the Tang monk Huilin's reference work, Sound and Meaning of All Scriptures. These entries show how people in Tang China translated and understood these objects. The entry for like nailing a stake defines this term as peg and identifies the materials that should be used in its creation. We also learn of a counterfeit stake that was produced during the time of the female Emperor Wu, which may have cast a pall over these objects. The next entries, single prong and single-pronged pestle, are fairly self-explanatory. Huilin's entries demonstrate an understanding of the Vajra stake as a wooden or metal implement used for nailing, and the related single-pronged pestle as a Vajra pestle with only 1 spike, rather than the common configurations of 3 or 5 spikes. Moreover, these entries, along with other Tang sources, suggest that the translators were not aware of texts or objects related to the 3-bladed Kila with an octagonal shaft, as described in Sanskrit sources and rendered in later Himalayan Buddhism. Buddhist translation work continued into the Song dynasty when Himalayan purba texts had begun to circulate. Song translations also engaged with the more transgressive content that was developing in South Asian Tantra. For the Kila, this meant expanding into more transgressive substances and purposes. Dhanapala's translation, Rituals for Accomplishing the Great Brilliance of Vajra Incense Bodhisattva, illustrates this shift. The scripture is framed as Vajrapani's request that the Buddha teach methods to neutralize the various demons terrorizing the world. In response, the Buddha adopts a wrathful form and teaches the mantra of Vajra Incense Bodhisattva, that is Vajradupa, as well as various rituals for attaining siddhi or accomplishment. So if you want to make an enemy leave the country, again, use human bone to make a Vajra stake and use human blood to dye the threads that you wrap around the stake. Use the stake to beat Maheshvara's head and step on the god Maheshvara with your left foot, etc. This passage introduces 2 new developments to Sinitic texts related to Kila. First, it prescribes the use of human bone and blood in Kila rituals, which aligns with the increasingly transgressive content of later tantras. Second, the ritual for driving away the enemy invokes the myth of Heruka defeating Rudra/Maheshvara. However, despite these textual shifts that brought East Asian understandings of Kila closer to contemporaneous South Asian and Himalayan traditions, there's no indication that Song dynasty Buddhist transmissions reintroduced Kila or purba as physical objects. Therefore, the material culture of daggers or stakes in East Asia looks very different than the Himalayan purba. Evidence of this material culture mainly survives from medieval Japan, but those references to Vajra stakes in Kukai and Engyo's catalogs suggest that these objects were used in Tang China as well. Early examples of the Vajra stakes brought to Japan can be seen here in a 12th century illustration and a single stake from Kofukuji, which was a particularly important monastery in Nara during the Nara and Heian periods. The center of the stake is a slightly bulging handle with a circular decoration known as demon eyes, kimoku. Double lotus blossom designs bookend these decorations. Extending from the handle, each end has a rhomboid shape with the widest point near the handle, but the tips differ. An oblong tip resting on a semicircular base adorns the top of the stake, while the bottom of the stake continues into a peg meant to be inserted into the ground. And this is broken off the stake from Kofukuji. This illustration appears in a section on protecting the altar, which lists the many substances and objects required for each ritual step. The Nara National Museum houses 2 Kamakura-era sets of 4 gilt bronze stakes from Kyoto's Toji that are better preserved than the single stake from Kofukuji. The top and bottom of the stakes feature a lotus blossom base. At the head of the stake, a round gem sits atop the blossom. At the bottom, a peg extends from the blossom so that the stake can be inserted into the ground. The stakes in both sets are about 30 centimeters long. All of these examples tell us something important about how Middle Period East Asian Buddhists encountered and used kila, namely as stakes and not daggers. The sets of 4 daggers recall the Susiddhikara Sutra's instructions to make 4 stakes and drive them into the 4 corners of the ritual area. Since these objects traveled to Japan from Tang China, they likely represent an earlier version of the kila than the daggers that developed in the Himalayas. Perhaps one explanation for the absence of kila in India is that we're looking for the wrong thing. However, another part of the East Asian story is that the single-pronged vajra seems to rise to the place of prominence occupied by purba in the Himalayas. East Asian texts regularly describe kila as stakes with one end sharpened into a single prong, which may also resemble this hybrid object, a stake with the shape of a single prong. Such objects may have resulted from and facilitated the conflation of the stake and the single-pronged vajra, which we can see closely resembled each other in Japan. They have different ends, but the handles both feature double lotus blossoms, framing a central register with 4 demon eyes. There are even some single-pronged stakes that replace this central register with demon heads, as we see in this example. Hara Asakaze notes that bija bells with demon heads were used in the Garbhadhatu mandala, while bells with demon eyes were used in the Vajradhatu mandala. So the combination of the 2 might reflect the single-pronged vajra's use in dual initiation ceremonies. So lest it seem that I'm following this thread too far away from our main object of investigation, let me note that these demonic or wrathful faces echo the 3 wrathful faces that adorn most purba, and we will encounter very similar objects again in Dali. If the kila did not become a centrally important ritual object in East Asia, as it did in the Himalayas, the single-pronged vajra enjoyed far more prominence in Japan than in other places. One reason is that the main island of Japan was said to be shaped like a single-pronged vajra, which Lucia Dolce has discussed in her study of religious maps of Japan. The 14th century Keiran Shuyoshu recounts the following question and answer. Question: why is our country said to have the shape of a single-pronged vajra? Answer: in the record of the Bodhisattva Gyoki, it is stated, the Bodhisattva Gyoki wandered around Japan. At that time, he drew what he saw. The shape of the country was the shape of a vajra. The 3 places of Ise, Lake Biwa, and the Northern Sea are the demon's eyes of the vajra. The text also defines Japan as a single-pronged vajra in comparison to China, which was conceived as a 3-pronged vajra, and India, which was a 5-pronged vajra. These examples highlight the distinctive importance of this ritual object in Japan. Vajra stakes and single-pronged vajras ended up in Japan via Tang China, and they would have arrived in China via maritime and overland routes that brought tantric monks from South to East Asia starting around the 8th century. This early date again suggests that the vajra stakes that ended up in medieval Japan actually represent early material versions of these objects than the purba that developed in the Himalayas. Yet additional types of daggers appear in Dali and Java, and these types raise additional questions about the historical development and transmission of these ritual objects. So the Dali kingdom ruled a large swath of land that encompassed all of present-day Yunnan province, parts of Sichuan and Guizhou provinces, and parts of Burma and Laos. Understanding the Dali kingdom, including its distinctive forms of Buddhism and its routes of transmission, requires first understanding the history and religion of the preceding Nanzhao kingdom. The Hmong rulers of Nanzhao proved particularly adept at expanding their territory by alternating allegiances to the larger empires on their border, Tang China and Tibet. After allying with Tang China to help curb Tibet's southwestern encroachment, Nanzhao broke with Tang to ally with Tibet in 752. Then in 794, tired of Tibet's demands, Nanzhao reinstated its alliance with Tang China. However, this alliance remained fragile as the 9th century saw frequent Nanzhao raids on Tang cities in Sichuan and attacks on Tang interests in Annam in present-day Vietnam. Nanzhao expansion in the 9th century coincided with its rulers' adoption of Buddhism. Among the large-scale Buddhist projects of 9th century Nanzhao were the grotto carvings at Stone Treasure Mountain to the northwest of the Dali Plain, the temple for revering the Holy One in the Nanzhao capital, the temple's 1,000-league pagoda, and the 899 illustrated history of Nanzhao that recounts in text and images how the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara introduced Buddhism to the region. One of the patterns set in the illustrated history that continues into the Dali kingdom is the combination of Sinitic script, including references to the Chinese classics, and images of Avalokiteshvara that drew on Indian and Southeast Asian iconography and esoteric Buddhism. Despite Nanzhao's decades-long alliance with Tibet, there are few Tibetan records about Nanzhao, and no Tibetan language materials have been found from either the Nanzhao or Dali kingdoms. Avalokiteshvara devotion, esoteric Buddhism, and this combination of Sinitic script and Indian iconography continued into the Dali kingdom, which was ruled by the Duan family, who had served as high-ranking officials under Nanzhao. The Duan rulers, like their late Nanzhao counterparts, claimed the title of emperor, Huang Di. While Nanzhao claims of imperial status had provoked Tang wrath, the Song court adopted a policy of non-engagement with Dali due to the Tang quagmire in the southwest. However, after northern channels for acquiring horses were cut off in the mid-12th century, the Song court looked to Dali for its horses. In exchange, the Dali court requested books, including Buddhist scriptures. Overall, there are fewer Song records about Dali than there are Tang records about Nanzhao. However, more materials survive from the Dali kingdom than from the Nanzhao kingdom, and most of these surviving materials are Buddhist. This makes Buddhism the best documented facet of Dali kingdom culture. Buddhist materials include architectural structures, stone carvings, paintings, manuscripts, and ritual objects and statues. Most of the latter two categories were recovered from the pagodas and temples in or near the Dali capital. The texts consist of 33 manuscripts from the capital's Buddha pagoda, as well as Dharma Treasury Temple, the family temple of the Dong clan, who served as national preceptors under the Dali kingdom. Most are Tang Dynasty Sinitic translations of popular Buddhist scriptures, such as the Lotus Sutra, Flower Garland Sutra, and Diamond Sutra, or the larger Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, which appears here. Dali Kingdom Buddhists, like their counterparts elsewhere in East Asia, used Sanskrit for dharani and mantras, but not much else. Also, like their Song Dynasty counterparts, Dali Kingdom Buddhists used Nagari script rather than the earlier Siddham. A Nagari syllabary survives from Dharma Treasury Temple, and Nagari is used for dharani, mantras, and bija. What sets Dali Kingdom Buddhist texts apart are the 6 ritual texts and 1 sub-commentary from Dharma Treasury Temple that have not been found elsewhere. The sub-commentary concerns Amoghavajra's scripture for humane kings to protect their countries. Of the 6 ritual texts, 2 focus on food distribution, 2 offer esoteric rituals for inviting various deities, 1 is a sadhana text devoted to the god Mahakala, and 1 is an extended Homa consecration ritual that centers on Vajrasattva. Though more research is needed on these 7 texts, it's apparent that most of them draw from genres and texts in Tang through Song China, such as water and land food distribution rituals, and many translations by Amoghavajra. However, they also contain references to deities or forms of deities that were not part of Tang through Song Buddhism, or which only played peripheral roles there, such as the god Mahakala. Dali Kingdom texts also use Sanskrit dharani that do not seem to appear elsewhere. and they use distinctive Sinitic translations and transliterations of Sanskrit terms, including kila. Stakes or daggers are mentioned in 2 Dali Kingdom manuscripts, the Great Consecration Ritual and ritual procedures for inviting Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Vajra beings, etc. Single-pronged Vajra pestles also appear in ritual procedures for inviting Buddhas, etc., as well as invitation ritual procedures for general use, where they are translated as single-toothed instead of single-pronged, suggesting a different route of transmission or translation process than in Tang through Song, China. Though these ritual manuals draw directly from several Tang texts, they probably incorporated other kinds of sources as well. For example, Kawasaki Kazuhiro has argued that parts of ritual procedures for inviting Buddhas, etc., drew from the Sanskrit Mayajala Tantras. Single-toothed only appears once in invitation ritual procedures for general use at the very end of the main ritual text. After receiving consecration from the Buddhas, the practitioner next circumambulates the various protectors, including the 3 Vajra beings, Heruka, Mighty Strength or Mahabala, and Single Tooth. Afterward, the practitioner snaps their fingers 3 times. This reference, brief though it may be, shows connections to Heruka and Mahabala's role in Himalayan purba ritual. It also suggests a conflation of the kila with the single-pronged Vajra, as here the term single-toothed seems to translate the name of the deity Kila or Vajra Kila. A lone reference to stakes appears in the inventory section of the Great Consecration Ritual, where we see that 25 stakes made of Kadira wood are required. I've not seen this number in other East Asian systems, though some Japanese texts prescribe the use of 28 or 52 stakes. More references to stakes and single-toothed objects appear in the ritual procedures for inviting Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Vajra beings, etc., which is a long compendium of rituals to invite a variety of powerful beings. This text prescribes the single-toothed mantra and mudra 31 times across several of its sections. In 3 places, the text gives versions of the following mantra in Sinitic transcription and or Nagari script, which indicates a common source with the Tang translations that render the mantra in similar ways, but with different Sinitic characters when Sinitic characters are used. These variations in the Sinitic characters and translation suggest that Dali Kingdom Buddhists were working with either alternative Sinitic translations or from manuscripts in other languages. One of the sections of the invitation rituals text that includes the Kili Kili mantra is dedicated to the white Vajra. This section also includes the text's only use of the character stake, jue, in the term Humkara stake, one of the deities of white Vajra's mandala. As we see in the full translation of this passage, Humkara stake happens to appear alongside the gods Vajra Heruka and Vajra Kundali on a triangular mandala. Triangular mandalas are commonly used in Tibetan purba rites, which describe them as prisons for harmful forces targeted in the ritual. The Dali Kingdom ritual text does not explicitly state this, but it does describe the triangular altar as follows. In the center of the mandala, draw 3 skulls, each encircled by a red serpent. Next, a gold wheel encircles these. Next, 3 corpses form a triangle that connects around the wheel and skulls with 3 black-topped gates. On the main side in front of the throne, draw a white syllable Om. This is Heruka Vajra, who controls living beings' greed. Next, inside the left gate, draw a blue-black syllable Am. This is Humkara Vajra above, who controls living beings' anger. Next, inside the right gate, draw a red syllable Ah. This is Kundali Vajra below, who controls living beings' ignorance. The ensuing ritual calls for the practitioner to manifest greed, anger, and ignorance, to first identify as these 3 Vajra beings, and then to transform these 3 poisons into awareness of true emptiness. As such, it aligns with some of the themes in Tibetan purba ritual. The manuscript even includes an illustration of this triangular mandala, which is extremely rare. This text only includes 1 other illustration. This material from the white Vajra mandala is highly significant. First, this mandala ties the invitation rituals manuscript to the 1170s painting of Buddhist images, as we will see shortly. Second, this section includes a triangular mandala that is both described and illustrated in the ritual text. Third, the mandala relates to deities such as Heruka and Amrita Kundalin that are tied to the purba in Tibetan texts. It thus does not seem to be a coincidence that this manuscript's only use of the term stake or jue appears in this section. To appreciate the significance of the manuscript's mandala illustration, let's look at it next to a frame from the painting of Buddhist images, a court-sponsored project that was overseen by the painter Zhang Shengwen. The triangular mandala forms the foundation upon which stands one of the many wrathful deities that populate the painting's latter section. The deity in question has 9 faces, 18 arms, and 3 legs, and black wing feathers and tail feathers are visible behind his many limbs and implements. Matsumoto Moritaka originally identified this figure as a Garuda king. However, given the connections to the white Vajra part of the ritual text, it seems more likely that this figure is a Heruka deity with Garuda features. Such deities appear in the Nyingma school, where they are closely associated with purba practices. While Heruka deities usually have 3 heads, 6 arms, and 4 legs, there are some Garuda deities with 9 heads and 18 arms, so they usually still have 4 legs. The winged figure in frame 118 of the painting of Buddhist images thus appears to be related to Kila or Purba deities. Another hint of this appears with the figure in frame 116, which appears to be Trilokya Vijaya. Though this figure holds a multi-pronged Vajra pestle in the painting, a very similar gilt bronze statue from Thousand League Pagoda wields a dagger or single-pronged Vajra pestle in that hand. Another frame from the painting of Buddhist images depicts the deity Uchushma, aka the Vajra being of impure traces, or Huiji Jingang, holding a single-pronged Vajra in one of his left hands. Uchushma is identified with the god Vajra Kumara, who is closely tied to Himalayan purba rituals. So, daggers from Dali resembling purba or single-pronged Vajras occasionally pop up in catalogs of museum exhibits or auctions, but few scholars have paid much attention to them. Albert Lutz gave an overview of these objects in the 1991 Der Goldschatz der drei Pagoden, in which he presciently suggested that the Dali daggers support the theory that purba originated in India and then spread north and east. It is difficult to determine the total number of daggers and single-pronged Vajras from Thousand League Pagoda because both are included in the excavation report's Vajra pestle category, which contained 213 objects. Of these 213 Vajra pestles, most were multi-pronged, double-headed Vajra pestles attached to a ring in the center. I know of several Dali Kingdom Purba-style daggers and only a few single-pronged Vajras, but there are undoubtedly more examples in private collections and museums outside Yunnan. The single-pronged Vajras have received less attention and there's less information about their composition and dimensions. However, photographs suggest that they were slightly shorter than the Purba-style daggers. The Purba daggers range in length from 11 to 19 centimeters and are made of copper, bronze, gilt bronze, and iron. An overview of 3 Dali Kingdom Purba-style daggers will further illustrate their similarities to and differences from their Himalayan counterparts. One of the most similar examples to Himalayan Purba is the only Dali Kingdom Purba-style dagger to only display the deity's head instead of also including the torso. This bronze dagger is 16.3 centimeters long with a 3-faceted blade below a ring of beads topped with a lotus blossom. The wrathful 3-faced deity sits above the lotus blossom, and a serpent ring extends from between the 2 faces on the sides. Its faces each have 3 eyes, and the main face bears upturned fangs. Above the deity's head is another lotus blossom that supports the 5-pronged Vajra finial. Though I do not know of any Himalayan purba that correspond perfectly to this dagger shows more similarities to Himalayan examples than any other Dali Kingdom object. Huntington's category of Vajra-topped purba comes the closest, particularly the subtype with the double lotus handles. Another Dali Kingdom dagger features a wrathful deity that resembles Dali Kingdom images of Mahakala. This is the only iron dagger I know of from the Dali Kingdom. It's 15.6 centimeters in length and has apertures along each of the 3 blades. The deity's torso rises up from the lotus blossom atop the blade. He wears a sash and necklace of skulls, and his hands appear to make the Abhisheka mudra, or the consecration mudra, in which the thumb and index fingers are pressed together, pointing up, while the remaining fingers interlace. He only has 1 face, and he appears to wear a tall crown instead of a 5-pronged Vajra. Like other Dali Kingdom daggers, a ring is affixed to the back, but it does not appear to be a serpent. The third example is a 12.7 centimeter long bronze dagger with a benign deity, making the Bodhagri mudra a 5-pronged vajra atop the deity's crown and a serpentine ring attached to the back. As in the previous example, a lotus blossom ferrule separates the deity above from the blade below. Unlike wrathful dagger deities, this figure wears jewelry rather than skulls and snakes. 2 ribbons flutter up from each side of the tall crown, which resembles several crowns depicted in the painting of Buddhist images and other contemporaneous bodhisattva images. The Bodhagri mudra led Lutz to identify this figure as Vairochana. Given that the tantric scriptures describe Vairochana making the Bodhagri mudra and wearing a jeweled crown, Lutz's identification appears to be correct. As a group, the Dali daggers most closely resemble the earliest known example from Huntington's study, the sandalwood dagger with a rounded blade and the torso and head of a 3-faced wrathful deity. Dali kingdom daggers also share with the Nepalese purba an emphasis on the deity image. None of these examples could be rolled between the palms. The Himalayan examples were kept in their stands, and the Dali examples were worn on the finger or perhaps looped on a string or piece of cloth. These conclusions also apply to the single-pronged vajras from the Dali kingdom, which are similarly attached to rings. 2 of these single-pronged vajras have faces separating the 2 blades, while the third separates the blades with the serpentine coils of the ring. One of the vajras has blades made of crystal with a ring attachment made of metal, while the other 2 are completely made of metal. The metal band in the middle of the crystal vajra has 3 wrathful faces, each with 3 eyes. One of the metal vajras has a single face separating the blades. The face resembles the bearded Mahakala type that also appears in Dali Kingdom Purba-style daggers. The face has a well-defined beard, fangs jutting up from his open mouth, 3 glaring eyes, a crown of skulls, and a miniature Buddha on the crown. Dali Kingdom daggers and similar objects resemble other stakes and daggers we have encountered this evening, as well as a few objects we have yet to fully encounter. First, Nicole and Patrick Grimaud observed that these Dali Kingdom daggers are very similar to Tibetan tokcha on rings, and I will further point out the nearly identical appearances of the multi-pronged vajra pestle rings that we see here. Second, the single-pronged vajras from the Dali Kingdom share a similar shape and demonic faces with the single-pronged vajras from medieval Japan, though other features differ. And lastly, when we compare Dali Kingdom daggers to other kinds of daggers, we see that they are relatively similar to the 14th century example that John Huntington identified. These daggers share certain features with standard purba, such as the demi-vajra or endless knot on top of the deity's heads, as well as the 3 wrathful faces making similar expressions. Further evidence for this style appears farther afield in Java. In the 1930s, F.D.K. Bosch wrote about the bronze purba-style dagger on the left, whose top half he identified as the deity Hayagriva, though I'm not completely sure why. This dagger is somewhat distinctive in having a quadrangular blade instead of a triangular blade, and in featuring a deity with only 1 face instead of 3. But these variations appear in Himalayan and Dali examples as well. More recently, Ito Naoko and Michel Gavin have written about the bronze dagger on the right, which differs only slightly from the other dagger. This figure makes the mudra of the god Trilokya Vijaya, which suggests that this is, in fact, Trilokya Vijaya. Both Javanese daggers have Sanskrit syllables inscribed on them, a hum in the case of the dagger on the left. A bronze purba also survives from Java, as does a small gold ring with a vajra pestle, which suggests a shared ritual material culture with Northeast Indian and Himalayan regions, as scholars such as Claudine Bautze-Piperon and Andrea Acri have shown. So these final comparisons bring us back to our guiding question. How did Kila, including analogous objects, travel along medieval Silk roads, and what does this tell us about Buddhist transmission? So first, let's consider the extant objects that we've surveyed. In the Himalayas, we mainly covered purba, including the variation in the sandalwood deity dagger and the variation of purba amulets or tokcha. We then look at Japanese stakes, which differed considerably from the Tibetan purba and Japanese single-pronged vajras. Third, we turn to the Dali kingdom, where we see deity daggers and single-pronged vajras that both seem to take the form of tokcha. Finally, we briefly considered the deity daggers from Java, along with a purba-style dagger and vajra ring. As we draw connections between similar objects, we can see that similar purba appear in the Himalayas and Java, and deity daggers appear in the Himalayas, Java, and Dali. Tokcha-style rings, especially those with vajras attached, appear in the Himalayas, Java, and Dali as well. Finally, the single-pronged vajras surveyed here appear in Dali and Japan. Though some of these connections remain buried, and it is always possible that new discoveries will reveal heretofore concealed routes of transmission, I think we can draw the following tentative conclusions about how these daggers and stakes circulated in medieval Buddhist Asia. Family resemblances between different kinds of daggers suggest specific points of connection. In the case of the purba style and deity daggers, as well as the amulets, I think the missing link is northeastern India, specifically the regions of Bihar and Bengal. Other features of Dali and Javanese Buddhism reveal connections to Bihar and Bengal. In Dali, images of the god Mahakala bear their closest resemblance to images from these regions, and aspects of the Nagari script used in Dali suggest links to Bengal. As for Java, Claudine Batze-Picron and Andrea Acri have shown the strong ties linking its Buddhist texts and art to northeastern India. For Japan and Dali, the point of connection seems to be Tang China, though it remains possible that single-pronged vajras traveled separately from South Asia, east to Japan, and northeast to Dali. In conclusion, the daggers from the Dali kingdom, when considered in relation to the example from Java and the earliest Himalayan examples, suggest that an early form of this object corresponded to the description of the dagger deity in early Tibetan texts. That is, these versions lack the octagonal shaft and endless knots. Their form resists rolling between the palms, and they would have been too valuable to use for demarcation. Instead, they materialize the power of the god Vajrakila or similar deities associated with this object. In Dali, the ritual texts reinforce this interpretation by consistently using the term Kila in deities' names. Such objects were probably carried from Bihar and Bengal to the Himalayas, to Dali, and to Java, where they took on different trajectories. Most studies of the Southern Silk Roads have focused on the circulation of commodities such as horses, silver, cowries, and tea. Dali Kingdom daggers show that Buddhist material culture and visual culture also circulated along these understudied routes, which introduces new possibilities for understanding Buddhist transmission in the middle period of around 800 to 1400. The Northern Silk Roads and Maritime Silk Roads remain critical channels for this transmission, but further studies of the Southwestern Silk Road may yield still more discoveries of Buddhist texts, images, and objects. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions for as long as you have them.
Wow, thank you very much for that amazing talk. It was really enjoyable, and I think really outstanding, both in its breadth and its precision. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. We are now open for question and answer. So if people in the audience would like to type their questions into the question and answer feature, I'll try to feed them to our speaker. The first question is a comment. Thank you so much. I'm clapping, smiley face. So much agreement about the quality of the lecture. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, maybe I'll just start with some questions that I have. I would be interested to hear if you have more to say about the triangular altar that the Kila fits into, which showed up in your presentation as a mandala, but which of course can be a physical object as well. And I'm wondering, just off the top of my head, do you see that as a sort of complex of two objects that transform together and travel together? Does the altar become its own separate thing? How would you describe those kinds of issues?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I guess I would have to limit the response to the objects for which there is that kind of triangular base, which is mainly the Himalayan objects that I'm sure you know a lot more about than I do. But my understanding would be to see those as the non-dual duality of having a necessary relationship. I don't think you can treat them completely separately, even if the dagger is removed from the base for certain practices. I think the Dali case, which is of course the one that I'm most familiar with, we don't have any surviving examples of a physical, altar mandala. We just have the illustration that also appears in the painting. But it seems that a physical object could have easily existed there, although the absence of daggers that would have fit in a base like that is significant as well, since the only daggers that we have are the rings, which don't require that sort of base. But people in Dali seem to be aware of other kinds of daggers, especially with the deities holding those daggers. So that remains one of the many lacuna in, I think, Dali Kingdom Buddhism. But yeah, thank you for this question. And I wish I could say more about it.
Great, thank you. We have another question from the audience. Is there any connection between the shape of the dagger and the achievement of non-duality?
So that's a great question as well. I'm not aware of any specific relationship between the dagger shape. I mean, I think that the parts of the dagger are certainly symbolic in terms of helping to effect the realization of non-duality with, I mean, the different deities related to the dagger visualized in connection to the dagger generating bodhicitta, or this kind of, thought of awakening. So that symbolic connection is relevant, but I'm not aware of like some of the variations that I covered necessarily relating to those issues. And yeah, I mean, in the Dali example, there's a focus on the awareness of emptiness, but it's not as directly related to the shape of the dagger. And in fact, there one becomes the triangular altar. So a later part of that ritual text describes the person, meditating in the shape of the triangular altar. And so that's how the understanding of emptiness is effected.
Oh, great, thank you. Maybe we have time for me to ask another of my own questions as we're sort of ping pong back and forth. I was, it's in sort of ritual literature, it can be common to make comparisons to things like the Yupa or Mount Meru and things like that, not just for purbas, but for other kinds of objects, for other kinds of concepts. But at the same time, to me at least, there seems to be something sort of unique and special about the kila that is distinguished from other kinds of ritual objects. That's sort of my intuition. I'm wondering if you share that idea, if you feel that what you've said about the kila gives us a model for thinking about ritual objects in general, or if there is something special that is distinguished about the kila that you've traced out.
Yeah, I mean, I think my understanding is that the kila, the purba, I guess more specifically, is distinctive in Himalayan Buddhism, where I think it has a much more elevated status as a ritual object. But the thing, I mean, the question that came to my mind is, why is it so important there and not, it doesn't seem to be as significant, even though there is this kind of shared tantric culture in this period. And so I think that like if we look at what happens in East Asia, it seems more akin to a lot of other kinds of ritual objects. And looking through some of the museum collections in Japan, not only are there, the single pronged vajra stakes or pestles, as well as the vajra stakes, the kila, there are also other objects called konpei in Japanese that are used especially for treating like eye diseases, and then to symbolically, cure the eyes of ignorance so that they can awaken to wisdom. And those like look very, very similar to the single-pronged vajras. So I think that though the kila, the purba have that kind of distinctive role in the Himalayas, that when they travel, like the significance and the understanding seems to really change. And that's why I think like attending to these analogous objects is really important, to not miss sort of what's happening in those other sites. So I think it's, trying to figure out, if the kila is not doing what it does in the Himalayas in East Asia, then what is kind of filling that role in some shape or form.
The question about analogous objects is a good segue to the next question. I think it seems that you make comparisons sort of lexically, like using similar terminology to describe objects. also structural relationships using different kinds of stakes and vertical objects and things like that, and also certain kinds of commonalities of ritual use and things like that. So how would you say this helps us develop a sort of theory of ritual objects in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, the kind of theoretical tool that has been helpful is really thinking about these objects as networks as opposed to as discrete entities. And I think that there was an article that I read about the kanaya, these like javelins or spears and bindi, like these other kinds of weapons, more specifically in especially Himalayan texts and South Asian texts, and the ways that Tibetan translators seem to be sort of struggling to render those terms, Sanskrit terms, into Tibetan, and this single-pronged, vajra or single-pronged, object was one of the terms that they kept going back to. And I think it really kind of clued me into the challenges that people in various parts of Buddhist Asia were dealing with in encountering these different terms and different objects, and how they were making reference to these new things and new terms, using the vocabulary they had at hand. And so this project is in some way sort of building on that and like very much empathizing with the challenge of making sense of what is this thing, and what do we call it, and what do we do with it, and especially from this kind of zoomed out perspective. So I think that the network idea there is to treat these objects as networks. So to not try to cut off the purba from all of these other things, but to see how it kind of fits as this kind of networked, entity, in a sense. So I think that for me is the ritual, the theoretical approach to ritual and ritual objects that I'm bringing in, because I think ritual itself is, and this will just drive the metaphor into the ground, but it's also a ritual, like a network in certain ways. It's this integrated, practice where you can't separate out one piece of it, that you have to consider it in its relationship to the other parts. And I think looking at ritual objects makes that very clear. And of course, I've kind of singled out this particular kind of object for this investigation, but I think that approach works in understanding ritual in a more general sense. For me, like the idea of a ritual assemblage, I think is useful to think with. What are the objects that people were putting together? I found the inventory at the end of that consecration ritual text from Dali especially interesting, because as the inventories do, it just lists all of the things that you need for the ritual, and that suggests, this whole, collection of things that people would have had to acquire and that were connected to each other textually, but then also three-dimensionally as well. So that would be, I guess, my response to the kind of theorizing ritual through this kind of approach, or theorizing ritual materiality through this kind of approach.
That's fantastic. A great answer, and I'm really looking forward to your book. This is very exciting. I think that we've addressed all the questions. So I want to, thank, of course, our audience for being here and for giving us such great questions. And thank you once again to our fabulous speaker, Dr. Megan Bryson. Before everybody logs off, I'm going to turn it over to Julia Grimes, who has an announcement about the rest of our series.
Hello, everyone. I'm Julia Grimes, the Foundation's Deputy Director, and I'd like to start with some thanks. First of all, Megan, thank you so much for your presentation today on Buddhist ritual daggers along the Silk Roads. A lot of connections that you made I'd never thought of before. It was fascinating to think of these understudied objects in this way and to see this flow, this transmission of information and of cultural products. So thank you for that. Eric, special appreciation goes out to you and to your colleague at Rice University, Shih-shan Susan Huang, for organizing this series and inviting Megan this evening. Heartfelt thanks to you both, as always. To our viewers, our sincere gratitude for joining us tonight. We, as always, greatly appreciate you and your support. Our webinar series will continue on December 1st with a presentation by Satomi Hiyama, who is Assistant Professor at the Hakubi Center for the Institute for Research in Humanities at Kyoto University. Her topic will be the multicultural and historical background of Mogao Cave 285. It's a very popular cave. I know a lot of people out there like that one. Through the study of its iconography and the pigments used for the wall paintings. So again, that will be Thursday, December 1st. We very much look forward to seeing you then. From all of us at Rice University, University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and the Dunhuang Foundation, we'd like to wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you very much and good night.